have drawn the trifecta tonight, you guys. You've got workplace health and safety, you've got workplace relations, and you've really topped it off with the exciting area of insurance. So congratulations to anyone that's still awake at the end of my presentation. You've done exceptionally well.
Middle one.
The middle one, okay. First, I'm here basically to talk about insurance, but a couple of points to make to start off with is insurance is really just part of a risk management program. It's really just transferring the risk, financial risk at least, to an insurance company. Obviously, as organisations, as business operators, our preference is to prevent the nasties happening in the first place. We do that via effective risk management programs and procedures and practices. Part of which is if everything else goes wrong, you've got insurance as a safety net to pick up some financial risk from that perspective. When we're talking about insurance, we need to make sure that the cover we've got is specific to the exposures we have as best as we possibly can, for those insurable exposures at least. And in the case of most people here, that's to do with their exposures from a recreation perspective. We need to make sure the insurance is covering the appropriate people that we need it to apply to. So if, for example, we're an organisation, we need to make sure we've got cover which is applying not just to the organisation as a legal entity, or a company as a legal entity, but also the people within those organisations, be it for exposures from a common law perspective as far as negligence, or be it from exposures such as we've just been talking about with OAMPS legislation, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. Covers can vary from insurer to insurer. So the fact that you might have a public liability policy, for example, doesn't necessarily mean the public liability policy you might get from X company is going to be exactly the same as the public liability policy you get from Y company, because potentially they will have different terms and conditions, potentially even different exclusions. So you need to make sure that the cover you are getting is really appropriate to what you need. And as I've said before, the last resort safety net, that's insurance. It does nothing to prevent the nasties. Our preference is to prevent the nasties. Important questions, and we'll go through these pretty quickly because again, I know we're going to have some questions at the end, and I've got a lot of slides, so we'll go through them pretty quickly and have the opportunity for questions at the end. What cover is being provided? Is it appropriate for recreation? For example, in recreation, we have people who are participating in activities. In some insurance policies for public liability, for example, you'll find that some particular activities might be exclusions. So obviously, if you're buying an insurance policy and your main activity is parachuting, it's not much use having a policy which excludes parachuting. So again, it's a matter of making sure you know what you're buying, you understand the policy you're getting. Who is covered? I guess I've sort of addressed that to a large extent. What exclusions apply? Policies are an important part of insurance policies is the section on exclusions. You need to make sure you know what they are and what they mean. Any special conditions they might have applying. I mean, and sometimes you can have insurers will apply a special condition to your policy, which may be you are required to have a certain risk management practice in place for the cover to be in effect. So we need, again, it's just an awareness thing. You just need to be aware of what the conditions are of your insurance policy. Where does the policy provide cover? What are the sums insured and the policy limits? What excesses apply? Is there any flexibility with that? Can you either reduce the excesses by paying extra money? Can you increase the excess by paying less money? Just going to go through the various type of liability insurances, and most of our discussions tonight are going to be based around the liability area, and there's various types of what I call liability insurances that we will be aware of and to varying degrees have a requirement for. The first one is probably the most people will be familiar with is public liability insurance, which relates to liability incurred for negligence as a result of breach of duty of care, which results in injury or property damage. We're going to go through these in a little bit more detail in a second. Professional indemnity, another one which particularly is applicable in the case of recreation type activities to coaches and instructors. The normal professional indemnity policy, which is often taken out, well, which would generally always be taken out by, for example, your legal your legal professions, your accounting professions, would normally, the traditional professional indemnity policy excludes liability emanating from injury or property damage. So there is a sort of a difference between the two different types of cover there, primarily from the fact that one excludes a liability emanating from injury or property damage, whereas the one, generally speaking, you people would require needs to include liability emanating from injury and property damage. The rest down here, directors and officers, you're probably familiar with. We're going to talk about these a little bit more later on. Association or organisation liability, you might have been familiar with, and management liabilities, I guess, is a more professional risk package, which sort of includes these other areas of cover as well, which we will talk about. Public liability, and I'm assuming most would be familiar with that, provides indemnity against liability incurred which is emanating from death or injury to third parties or loss or damage to property of third parties due to negligence. An important point there is it does exclude, there is an exclusion on public liability insurance for breach of professional duty, which predominantly relates to advice, errors and omissions with advice given. And as I say, that comes under the area of professional indemnity. So it's not that you can't insure it, it's just that under public liability, breach of professional duty is an exclusion under the policy. Multiple parties can be included in a negligence claim, which gets back to what I sort of mentioned before, as to making sure you've got the appropriate people insured under your policy. So if you're an organisation, an association that has instructors or coaches, you want to ideally protect them as well as the entity of the organisation itself. Because if something goes wrong, if someone is injured seriously and there is a liability claim, a claim for breach of duty of care, the usual practice would be the legal profession will take action against every Tom, Dick and Harry they think they might be able to include, and let the courts decide who, if anyone, is going to have been negligent. So you could find, for example, if you had a situation where it's the instruction situation, sport's probably an easy example. If it happens on a football field or something goes wrong, you could find action being taken against the coach, against the referee, against the first aid person, against the club itself, all for that same incident, and leave it up to the courts to, as I say, determine who, if anyone, as well as the entity, is going to be held to be legally liable. So again, just need to make sure that you have all those people covered that need to be covered. And again, we need to make sure that we haven't got an exclusion in the policy in relation to the activities which we are conducting. And I think that's probably pretty self-explanatory. There's a typical claim example. So you could probably think of it, one that's also with relates to more to a recreation side rather than a sports side. Typical example would be a football game commencing without goalpost padding.